Now let's go over to Stan in the radio booth. Stan.
Thanks, Ann. I'm here with Tony Bennett, State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to ask you first about what Shamika was mentioning in the beginning, that study from KEEP that talks about the achievement gaps and that shows that as of right now they are still widening. What do you, as superintendent, have the ability to do to address that or, in fact, improve it?
Well, Stan, one of the most recent things we have done is really focus how we look at measuring children. And the best way for me to describe that is to talk about how we currently do it. You know, we currently talk about how kids, if they are able to jump over a bar at a certain age group. And we know that many of our students, especially in some of our most disadvantaged areas, come to us not able to jump over the 6th grade bar when they get to 6th grade. But we also know that we have great teachers in great schools that are helping those children grow. So we, in the Department of Education, this year are rolling out a growth model to see if we are growing our population, because part of this achievement gap has been the fault of our own. Our other panelists were exactly right. A lot of it has to do with providing culturally competent learning environments for children, but it also has to do with, are we really looking at pushing our lowest 25% of our student population up? And if you haven't had an assessment and an assessment interpretation system that looks at that lowest 25% and looks at how you're pushing them up, you end up kind of neglecting to do that. So that's really have been a big focus of ours in terms of this initiative.
One of our state senators around here, Vi Simpson, has said that she thinks the state funding formula, which was just adopted last budget session, may need to be scrapped and we may need to start from scratch next year. How much does how the state funding formula for public education works? How much does that affect your ability to address things like these achievement gaps and you know, money of urban schools versus suburban schools, things like that?
Well, Stan, that's an age-old argument. We could have a dozen different superintendents from a dozen different types of schools, and they would all have different opinions. Generally speaking, I think we can say that, you know, I'm not sure there's a real strong correlation that if we keep putting money into the system, we're going to get better results. What I do believe is we have to focus those resources and focus that money. And we have to focus it on the things that matter the most. So again, to me, this is an issue of us providing the right learning environment with the right strategies and measuring those correctly so that we are truly able to see if we're doing two things. Are we driving student growth up to achievement? And two, are we reducing the gaps? The other thing I would say, Stan, is let's take a look at what the federal government invests their money in. The federal government invests the vast majority of their money in disadvantaged children, either disadvantaged through a special need, disadvantaged through socioeconomics or another at-risk factor, or disadvantaged because they do not speak English as a first language. So we, through the federal government, need to make sure we channel those funds and channel those resources and the strategies, the practices, and assess and measure those strategies and practices and make sure we're getting the results we want.
As far as channeling that money goes, I wondered if the governor, in deciding to cut about $300 million from the public education budget to try to meet state revenue, consulted you about the amount of money or how to take that money and how to apply those cuts.
Well, great question, Stan, because, you know, we knew with the state, with K-12 education being about 50% of the state's budget, there was going to become a time where we were going to have to address education in those cuts. And we got to that day. So we held a public hearing. The State Board of Education held a public hearing around Christmas time. We heard from many superintendents, many school board members, their representatives in the State House, who said two things to us. Make it one cut in 2010. Don't come to us and cut again, because that would be devastating. And secondly, act quickly. Let us know what's going to happen. Let us have time to adjust ourselves. So we knew where the cuts would be. I think most folks in education knew what we were looking at in terms of revenue shortfalls, what our shortage was. So I think most folks had a pretty good idea how much the cut was going to be, and then we posted a citizens checklist to allow great superintendents like Teran Armstrong to have very difficult conversations in her district about how to handle those cuts, because they are difficult conversations.
Right. We'll talk. We'll get back to those in just a second, but right now I need to send it back to Ann in the studio. So Ann, back to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Stan. And speaking of that, and Dr. Bennett just talked about Teran in your school district. Was this difficult for your?
Of course. This is a real paradigm shift for teachers and administrators and parents. Indiana has always funded schools very conscientiously, and we still want to be conscientious. All of the taxpayers in Indiana want good schools and great things for our kids. We're just having to face the economic realities that we're dealing with, and so like Dr. Bennett said, we're having to be very, very creative. But I think one of the things that we need to keep foremost in our mind is that education is for all children, that when we make these cuts, we need to be fair across the board, that we're not unduly burdening any group of children that in these decisions.
Okay, I'd like to come back to that conversation we were having before too, and also what Tony Bennett and Stan were talking about in terms of assessment. Stephanie, can we go to you? In terms of assessment, are we really looking at the broad spectrum here in terms of all students?
Well, when you think about African American education, historically, when you look at assessments, we're always failing. I mean, African American students are failing, so it's problematic when you're trying to figure out how to create an assessment that's not culturally biased. And so for me, assessments become problematic. And if you know, one could talk about money, but not putting any money in the system to really look at these issues could become problematic too. And I know that we have an increasingly shortfall in terms of the budget, but it will unduly affect students who've been historically marginalized.
Gerardo, can you speak to this as well in terms of assessment and minority students?
Yeah, when it comes to minority students, and of course being Hispanic, I'm more familiar with our plight. We get to dealing with assessments that, as Stephanie mentioned, that are not reflecting really what our cultural background is, and that's one of the reasons, as we were talking with Teran, if we're being assessed from an Anglo or an American assessment viewpoint, and as we were saying with Teran, they're reading to elementary students, they're reading books that have to do with as I was saying, pancakes or what have you, and it's something that they don't recognize because it's something that is not in their culture. And of course those students are also going to fail. So there definitely needs to be some type of switch in, as Teran was saying, the paradigm, so that that students can positively reflect their knowledge.
Yeah, what can we do?
And we have to look at assessment. Assessment has two components. It's not all just a thumbs up and a thumbs down for the child. It is very important for instructors and teachers to take the results of that assessment and say, what can I do better? What can I do differently? How can I adjust my instruction? What do I need to know? I'm the professional here. This is an 8-year-old. If he's not learning how to read, it's not his fault. I have 4 college degrees. I should be able to figure this out. So I need to take that assessment information and do something about it, not just evaluate a child and say, you're good, you're a go or you're a no-go.
Yeah.
Stephanie, you want to say?
Teachers also have to have the resources to do that, and that is a concern that I have. That the resources. I mean, in this district, middle and elementary schools don't have librarians. Won't have librarians, but the emphasis is on reading. So there's some contradictions here that we're going to have to address if we're trying to really improve the achievement gap.
And some of the ways that I know, Stephanie, I just want to mention that you're trying to do this kind of on your own. We're seeing video of a tutoring program that you do with young women and young girls here in Monroe County. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, actually, the tutoring program is for African American youth in the Bloomington community. It was started by a diversity grant, actually a profit grant and then a diversity grant received funding. My philosophy is schools can't do everything. So it is important that communities also engage in supporting schools. And so CLIP is really a community-based program that emphasizes the possibilities of African American youth and the potential. It's just flipping the lens and the paradigm to see what they can contribute.
Get more to this discussion in just a minute. Let's go to Stan in the radio booth. Stan?
Thanks, Ann. When we left off, you were talking about the citizens checklist, and one of the things it tries to do is avoid layoffs, and you recently criticized some superintendents. You said we're not having the tough discussions, especially with people like teachers' unions, and we're not doing enough necessarily perhaps to avoid those layoffs. Is it possible that if the state's revenue keeps coming in lower and lower and lower, and we have to keep cutting to meet that, that anyone's going to be able to avoid layoffs in the long run?
Well, I think, Stan, we have to start with the premise that what we did with this expenditure reduction, with this budget reduction, was really reset Teran Armstrong's budget in Seymour. To think that in 2011, Teran Armstrong is going to get the money she lost from Seymour schools in 2010 is unrealistic. So what we are advocating is to have those discussions that will help us reset those budgets so that we can make those decisions. Because right now, we really have some structural issues that Teran has to deal with inside of Seymour schools that really, in essence, maybe tie her hands as a superintendent from being able to make reductions and keep the reductions as far away from the classroom as possible. And that was the intent of the Citizens Checklist. And I believe if we would go to that tool and use that tool, we would see superintendents have more ability through those tough discussions to be more flexible and to be able to adjust in tough economic times.
State Representative Matt Pierce, who's running for re-election here in Bloomington, recently criticized his opponent in the race for being for both property tax caps and for education spending additions. And Representative Pierce says you can't be for those property tax caps, for instance, being put in the state constitution and at the same time say, well, I'm really for education. Do you believe that's a fair criticism that he's making of his opponent?
No, I don't. And the reason I don't is I don't care what our economic condition is. We should have incredibly high expectations for all of our children. And we have an opportunity in this state. We have a unique opportunity as you and I sit here conversing tonight as we compete for Race to the Top money, which is driven at education reform in this country. It's a very unique opportunity for Indiana to bring in a large sum of money, not to fund the way we've always done things. And I think we've heard our other panelists talk how it hasn't worked. Secretary Duncan and President Obama have been very clear. They want to fund a different way of doing things so we do reduce gaps and raise achievement.
I spoke a little while ago about Senator Simpson saying she thought the funding formula should be changed. I spoke a few months ago with Sheila Klinker from Lafayette, herself a longtime educator, and she said that she was told over and over by a former budget director that property taxes were the most reliable way to fund education. Obviously, the state has gone about changing that a little bit. How do you think that that the future of education funding will look based on the fact that property taxes are no longer the way that we're going in Indiana?
Well, there's no question. I think the first thing I think we have to say is let's not use this recession as the example, because we all acknowledge that this has been as deep as it's been in a long, long, long time. So can we develop systems in education that are able to adjust to the normal economic ebb and flow? I believe we can. Now, it's going to take, and again, I'm going to use Teran as an example, it's going to take discussions where maybe Seymour Community Schools and the city of Seymour begin to do things together. It's going to take measures like Vince Bertram used down in Evansville, where he actually began to take over some of the back office operations for New Harmony Schools, which allowed New Harmony Schools to preserve its neighborhood school. So we will have to take a look at some very creative ways of the 2,600 taxing units coming together and maximizing the dollars they have to provide the services they need, and for education to do the same to educate our children.
Tony Bennett is the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Indiana. We thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
And back to you in the studio.
All right. Thanks so much, Stan.